Hi class, I am going to take a try here at demonstrating a few techniques regarding watercolor. And we had this piece where we were working to create various techniques. And so I have this on my presentation, and this particular demonstration sheet covers a variety of different techniques for using watercolor. But the main things I want you to pay attention to on this sheet are when you see something that says wet paper, so it's a wet on wet, so the watercolor is wet and dropped on wet paper, then wet paint on dry paper. And so I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate that real quick with this new sheet here. And I'm going to take care of applying in this first square the technique of wetting paper. And so the surface is going to have a nice glisten. And that's the intention, is you know, for a wet on wet technique, you fully wet the paper. And so you can ultimately see kind of a nice sheen that's right there on that square. And you can see that it's a wet paper. And so with that technique, we then mix a little paint, and we have the paint in our palette. And we've set the palettes up to mimic the color wheel. And so if you're interested in purchasing a little pocket color wheel, you can get one of those from online. But they're very simple in helping you to look at when you mix adding black to a color, adding white to a color, and then the variations of gray, and just helping to understand watercolor mix terminology. So it's a really cool little pocket color wheel. But I've used our color palette in the form of kind of trying to lay it out to mimic a color wheel. Some variations exist here, but right now I'm using the cerulean blue, and it's looking a little funny because some of the white actually got in there. So I'm going to go ahead, pick up the cerulean, and it's very strong color. And I'm going to actually pick up a little bit of Ultra Deep just because, and I'm mixing right here in the center. The Ultra Deep has a little bit more of a rich blue tone, and I'm just going to practice with that. So again, the paper's wet, and so I'm making sure that I have a fully glistening, you know, I probably don't want it to be super, super wet, so give it a second to dry. If it's super wet, what happens is you can see that everything creates kind of this cool cloud-like effect, but that's not 100% what I'm trying to go for, because we're going to render the furniture with these different techniques, and one of them will be this wet on wet. So right now I've got a little wet brush. You can see here the consistency of it is probably a almost like a milk, but maybe a little bit lighter, and I'm just going to gently take that color and spread it across. And you can see the paper is just a little too wet. And so it's doing this bloom. And bloom is nice, but it's not for what I need right now. So my paper is just way too wet. So let me try and give it a second to dry. But I want you to see what the wet paint looks like on dry paper. And you can see here it gives you a much straighter stroke. It's very solid. And this is a very wet paint, so it means I've got a lot of water in it. And you can always vary, and we've talked about paints being in consistency of a tea, which is like slightly tinted, then maybe it's coffee, it's a little bit more darker, and then of course we have what I said was milk, which is kind of a, thick, and then of course cream is really thick. You rarely use a lot of cream kind of techniques because you want the intentions to have white space and a lot of water. So you can see here I've got, I'm just bringing in on a dry paper, I'm placing the wet paint. And I'll go back over here and see if I can get some of this. Okay, there you go. That's actually a really nice glisten, soft, and and, you know, practicing different techniques with watercolor, I can wait for that to dry a little bit, maybe try to lift some, you know, do some different techniques. But the point of going over this again, even though I've already walked you through in class this particular tip sheet, is that I want you to really understand when I say wet on wet or wet on dry. So the dry is the paper is dry and the wet on wet is the paper is wet. Those are the two main techniques that we're using. We're going to have to really use the dry paper when we need to get a definite line. And you can see here, I of course used a very straight brush. It's got this flat edge, but when I was creating this sort of interesting mark, which kind of reminds you of our marker or maybe pen and ink, but my intention here was to play and practice a little bit of chrome because some of our legs are going to have chrome. And then also just kind of getting a nice strong straight mark. And that was the consistency on a dry paper of about milk. And so I had this nice flat brush and I was using that to create kind of a nice straight line. You can see here, just giving you a little bit of technique. And you can see it's really strong, creates a nice definition. If I need to, you know, pull in color and sort of just practice with a straighter object. And, you know, like chrome, for example, where we talk about having abstract shapes, but they are driven by a very straight line. You know, they're not very fluid. Chrome's really difficult to show if you're trying to say something like over here. But I'm just going to practice dropping in some of that Payne's gray so you can see what happens when the paper's still so wet, everything blooms. You know, and that could be really cool if that's your pattern. But if not, it really can make a hot mess of your work. And so I'll go over here and just show you again on the dry paper the different variations. So this is wet brush, dry paper, wet brush. Okay? The two variations. And then this is a really solid, strong, heavy coated of color brush. So finishing out this particular video, I just want to talk to you about some of the tools. We went over creating a very helpful tip sheet. Make sure you just write what everything is that you've applied so you can practice and see different techniques. I find it really helpful anytime, and I can always go back to it when I have ideas. I want to talk to you a bit about having another type of sheet where you're practicing techniques. And again, we taped it off in a grid. But here's an example. This is kind of a fun sheet where I was practicing blending colors. So in class, we went over a gradation and I did a dropped in. So that's this particular one here where I dropped in 2 colors on a wash. And you know, kind of a soft gradation where I went, you know, through a nice transition. Well, I thought it'd be kind of fun to take different color palettes and practice with those. So I've got sort of a blue and its opposite color orange, and then when they mix together, they create a neutral. I was playing with kind of a blue and a red to get kind of a purple tone, and then of course purple over here with gold, and the golden and the purple tones, they're color opposites. So when they blend together, they're going to create a neutral. So it's really important to remember that when we take the color opposites on our color wheel, so maybe a violet color and a yellow, when they are blended together, they create sort of a nice neutral. And so my go-to, before I go and get Payne's gray and drop it in for really strong grays, is to try to see if I can blend a little bit of the drop color in of the color opposite and see if that helps me where I need for shadows. So this is finishing out our tip sheets. This is one type. This is the other type that we were practicing in class. We're going to mainly stick to today where we're going to do wet paint on dry paper, and we're going to also do things like a wet wash, and we're going to drop in color opposites. So we'll have 2 differences. Really these 2 that I kind of stick for the rendering of the furniture. All sorts of other things can be picked up for patterns if you want to try them, but just for today, I'm going to stick with these two. Don't forget that you have a nice little palette to create with your color wheel. I've been mixing color in the center, and that's fine. You have another lid you guys could blend colors on. I have other areas, surfaces, you can get a paper plate and just blend some color so that you can see the differences of when you mix a color opposite together and how it gives you that neutral.